Chapter 14. Susie never forgot the horror of that journey to England. They arrived in London early in the morning and, without stopping, drove to Euston. For 3 or 4 days there had been unusual heat, and even at that hour the streets were sultry and airless. The train north was crowded, and it seemed impossible to get a breath of air. Her head ached, but she was obliged to keep a cheerful demeanour in the effort to allay Arthur's increasing anxiety. Dr. Porhoët sat in front of her. After the sleepless night, his eyes were heavy and his face deeply lined. He was exhausted. At length, after much tiresome changing, they reached Venning. She had expected a greater coolness in that northern country. But there was a hot blight over the place, and, as they walked to the inn from the little station, they could hardly drag their limbs along. Arthur had telegraphed from London that they must have rooms ready, and the landlady expected them. She recognized Arthur. He passionately desired to ask her whether anything had happened since he went away, but forced himself to be silent for a while. He greeted her with cheerfulness. "Well, Mrs. Smithers, what has been going on since I left you?" he cried. "Of course you wouldn't have heard, sir," she answered gravely. He began to tremble, but with an almost superhuman effort controlled his voice. "Has the squire hanged himself?" he asked lightly. "No, sir, but the poor lady's dead." He did not answer. He seemed turned to stone. He stared with ghastly eyes. "Poor thing," said Susie, forcing herself to speak. "Was it very sudden?" The woman turned to Susie, glad to have someone with whom to discuss the event. She took no notice of Arthur's agony. "Yes, Mum. No one expected it. She died quite sudden-like. She was only buried this morning." "What did she die of?" asked Susie, her eyes on Arthur. She feared that he would faint. She wanted enormously to get him away, but did not know how to manage it. "They say it was heart disease," answered the landlady. "Poor thing. It's a happy release for her. Won't you get us some tea, Mrs. Smithers? We're very tired, and we should like something immediately." "Yes, miss, I'll get it at once." The good woman bustled away. Susie quickly locked the door. She seized Arthur's arm. "Arthur! Arthur!" She expected him to break down. She looked with agony at Dr. Porhoët, who stood helplessly by. "You couldn't have done anything if you'd been here. You heard what the woman said. If Margaret died of heart disease, your suspicions were quite without ground." He shook her away almost violently. "For God's sake, speak to us!" cried Susie. His silence terrified her more than would have done any outburst of grief. Dr. Porhoët went up to him gently. "Don't try to be brave, my friend. You will not suffer as much if you allow yourself a little weakness." "For heaven's sake, leave me alone," said Arthur hoarsely. They drew back and watched him silently. Susie heard their hostess come along to the sitting-room with tea, and she unlocked the door. The landlady brought in the things. She was on the point of leaving them when Arthur stopped her. "How do you know that Mrs. Haddo died of heart disease?" he asked suddenly. His voice was hard and stern. He spoke with a peculiar abruptness that made the poor woman look at him in amazement. "Dr. Richardson told me so." Had he been attending her? "Yes, sir. Mr. Haddo had called him in several times to see his lady." "Where does Dr. Richardson live?" "Why, sir, he lives at the White House near the station." She could not make out why Arthur asked these questions. "Did Mr. Haddo go to the funeral?" "Oh, yes, sir. I've never seen anyone so upset." "That'll do. You can go." Susie poured out the tea and handed a cup to Arthur. To her surprise, he drank the tea and ate some bread and butter. She could not understand him. The expression of strain and the restlessness, which had been so painful, were both gone from his face, and it was set now to a look of grim determination. At last he spoke to them. "I'm going to see this doctor. Margaret's heart was as sound as mine." "What are you going to do?" "Do?" He turned on her with a peculiar fierceness. "I'm going to put a rope round that man's neck, and if the law won't help me, by God, I'll kill him myself." "Mais, mon ami, vous êtes fou!" cried Dr. Porhoët, springing up. Arthur put out his hand angrily, as though to keep him back. The frown on his face grew darker. "You must leave me alone. Good heavens! The time has gone by for tears and lamentation. After all I've gone through for months, I can't weep because Margaret is dead. My heart is dried up. But I know that she didn't die naturally, and I'll never rest so long as that fellow lives." He stretched out his hands, and with clenched jaws prayed that one day he might hold the man's neck between them, and see his face turn livid and purple as he died. "I am going to this fool of a doctor, and then I shall go to Skene." "You must let us come with you," said Susie. "You need not be frightened," he answered. "I shall not take any steps of my own till I find the law is powerless. I want to come with you all the same." "As you like." Susie went out and ordered a trap to be got ready, but since Arthur would not wait, she arranged that it should be sent for them to the doctor's door. They went there at once, on foot. Dr. Richardson was a little man of 55, with a fair beard that was now nearly white and prominent blue eyes. He spoke with a broad Staffordshire accent. There was in him something of the farmer, something of the well-to-do tradesman, and at the first glance his intelligence did not impress one. Arthur was shown with his two friends into the consulting room, and after a short interval the doctor came in. He was dressed in flannels and had an old-fashioned racket in his hand. "I'm sorry to have kept you waiting, but Mrs. Richardson has got a few lady friends to tea, and I was just in the middle of a set." His effusiveness jarred upon Arthur, whose manner by contrast became more than usually abrupt. "I have just learnt of the death of Mrs. Haddo. I was her guardian and her oldest friend. I came to you in the hope that you would be able to tell me something about it." Dr. Richardson gave him at once the suspicious glance of a stupid man. "I don't know why you come to me instead of to her husband. He will be able to tell you all that you wish to know." "I came to you as a fellow practitioner," answered Arthur. "I am at St. Luke's Hospital." He pointed to his card, which Dr. Richardson still held. "And my friend is Dr. Porhoët, whose name will be familiar to you with respect to his studies in Malta fever." "I think I read an article of yours in the BMJ," said the country doctor. His manner assumed a singular hostility. He had no sympathy with London specialists, whose attitude towards the general practitioner he resented. He was pleased to sneer at their pretensions to omniscience and quite willing to pit himself against them. "What can I do for you, Mr. Burden?" "I should be very much obliged if you would tell me as exactly as possible how Mrs. Haddo died." "It was a very simple case of endocarditis." "May I ask how long before death you were called in?" The doctor hesitated. He reddened a little. "I'm not inclined to be cross-examined," he burst out, suddenly making up his mind to be angry. "As a surgeon, I dare say your knowledge of cardiac diseases is neither extensive nor peculiar. But this was a very simple case, and everything was done that was possible. I don't think there's anything I can tell you." Arthur took no notice of the outburst. "How many times did you see her?" "Really, sir, I don't understand your attitude. I can't see that you have any right to question me." "Did you have a post-mortem?" "Certainly not. In the first place, there was no need, as the cause of death was perfectly clear, and secondly, you must know as well as I do that the relatives are very averse to anything of the sort. You gentlemen in Harley Street don't understand the conditions of private practice. We haven't the time to do post-mortems to gratify a needless curiosity." Arthur was silent for a moment. The little man was evidently convinced that there was nothing odd about Margaret's death, but his foolishness was as great as his obstinacy. It was clear that several motives would induce him to put every obstacle in Arthur's way, and chief of these was the harm it would do him if it were discovered that he had given a certificate of death carelessly. He would naturally do anything to avoid social scandal. Still, Arthur was obliged to speak. "I think I'd better tell you frankly that I'm not satisfied, Dr. Richardson. I can't persuade myself that this lady's death was due to natural causes." "Stuff and nonsense!" cried the other angrily. "I've been in practice for hard upon 35 years, and I'm willing to stake my professional reputation on it." "I have reason to think you are mistaken." "And to what do you ascribe death, pray?" asked the doctor. "I don't know yet." "Upon my soul, I think you must be out of your senses. Really, sir, your behavior is childish. You tell me that you are a surgeon of some eminence." "I surely told you nothing of the sort. Anyhow, you read papers before learned bodies and have them printed. And you come with as silly a story as a Staffordshire peasant who thinks someone has been trying to poison him because he's got a stomachache. You may be a very admirable surgeon, but I venture to think I am more capable than you of judging in a case which I attended and you know nothing about. I mean to take the steps necessary to get an order for exhumation, Dr. Richardson, and I cannot help thinking it will be worth your while to assist me in every possible way." "I shall do nothing of the kind. I think you very impertinent, sir. There is no need for exhumation, and I shall do everything in my power to prevent it. And I tell you, as chairman of the Board of Magistrates, my opinion will have as great value as any specialist's in Harley Street." He flounced to the door and held it open. Susie and Dr. Porhoët walked out, and Arthur, looking down thoughtfully, followed on their heels. Dr. Richardson slammed the street door angrily. Dr. Porhoët slipped his arm in Arthur's. "You must be reasonable, my friend," he said. "From his own point of view, this doctor has all the rights on his side. You have nothing to justify your demands. It is monstrous to expect that for a vague suspicion you will be able to get an order for exhumation." Arthur did not answer. The trap was waiting for them. "Why do you want to see Haddo?" insisted the doctor. "You will do no more good than you have with Dr. Richardson." "I have made up my mind to see him," answered Arthur shortly. "But there is no need that either of you should accompany me." "If you go, we will come with you," said Susie. Without a word, Arthur jumped into the dog-cart, and Susie took a seat by his side. Dr. Porhoët, with a shrug of the shoulders, mounted behind. Arthur whipped up the pony, and at a smart trot they traversed the 3 miles across the barren heath that lay between Venning and Skene. When they reached the park gates, the lodge-keeper, as luck would have it, was standing just inside, and she held one of them open for her little boy to come in. He was playing in the road and showed no inclination to do so. Arthur jumped down. "I want to see Mr. Haddo," he said. "Mr. Haddo's not in," she answered roughly. She tried to close the gate, but Arthur quickly put his foot inside. "Nonsense! I have to see him on a matter of great importance." "Mr. Haddo's orders are that no one is to be admitted." "I can't help that. I'm proposing to come in, all the same." Susie and Dr. Porhoët came forward. They promised the small boy a shilling to hold their horse. "Now then, get out of here," cried the woman. "You're not coming in, whatever you say." She tried to push the gate to, but Arthur's foot prevented her. Paying no heed to her angry expostulations, he forced his way in. He walked quickly up the drive. The lodge-keeper accompanied him with shrill abuse. The gate was left unguarded, and the others were able to follow without difficulty. "You can go to the door, but you won't see Mr. Haddo," the woman cried angrily. "You'll get me sacked for letting you come." Susie saw the house. It was a fine old building in the Elizabethan style, but much in need of repair, and it had the desolate look of a place that has been uninhabited. The garden that surrounded it had been allowed to run wild, and the avenue up which they walked was green with rank weeds. Here and there a fallen tree, which none had troubled to remove, marked the owner's negligence. Arthur went to the door and rang a bell. They heard it clang through the house as though not a soul lived there. A man came to the door, and as soon as he opened it, Arthur, expecting to be refused admission, pushed in. The fellow was as angry as the virago, his wife, who explained noisily how the three strangers had got into the park. "You can't see the squire, so you'd better be off. He's up in the attics, and no one's allowed to go to him." The man tried to push Arthur away. "Be off with you, or I'll send for the police." "Don't be a fool," said Arthur. "I mean to find Mr. Haddo." The housekeeper and his wife broke out with abuse, to which Arthur listened in silence. Susie and Dr. Porhoët stood by anxiously. They did not know what to do. Suddenly a voice at their elbows made them start, and the two servants were immediately silent. "What can I do for you?" Oliver Haddo was standing motionless behind them. It startled Susie that he should have come upon them so suddenly, without a sound. Dr. Porhoët, who had not seen him for some time, was astounded at the change which had taken place in him. The corpulence which had been his before was become now a positive disease. He was enormous. His chin was a mass of heavy folds distended with fat, and his cheeks were puffed up so that his eyes were preternaturally small. He peered at you from between the swollen lids. All his features had sunk into that hideous obesity. His ears were horribly bloated, and the lobes were large and swelled. He had apparently a difficulty in breathing, for his large mouth, with its scarlet, shining lips, was constantly open. He had grown much balder, and now there was only a crescent of long hair stretching across the back of his head from ear to ear. There was something terrible about that great shining scalp. His paunch was huge. He was a very tall man and held himself erect, so that it protruded like a vast barrel. His hands were infinitely repulsive. They were red and soft and moist. He was sweating freely, and beads of perspiration stood on his forehead and on his shaven lip. For a moment, they all looked at one another in silence. Then Haddo turned to his servants. "Go," he said. As though frightened out of their wits, they made for the door and with a bustling hurry flung themselves out. A torpid smile crossed his face as he watched them go. Then he moved a step nearer his visitors. His manner had still the insolent urbanity which was customary to him. "And now, my friends, will you tell me how I can be of service to you?" "I have come about Margaret's death," said Arthur. Haddo, as was his habit, did not immediately answer. He looked slowly from Arthur to Dr. Porhoët, and from Dr. Porhoët to Susie. His eyes rested on her hat, and she felt uncomfortably that he was inventing some jibe about it. "I should have thought this hardly the moment to intrude upon my sorrow," he said at last. "If you have condolences to offer, I venture to suggest that you might conveniently send them by means of the penny post." Arthur frowned. "Why did you not let me know that she was ill?" he asked. "Strange as it may seem to you, my worthy friend, it never occurred to me that my wife's health could be any business of yours." A faint smile flickered once more on Haddo's lips, but his eyes had still the peculiar hardness which was so uncanny. Arthur looked at him steadily. "I have every reason to believe that you killed her," he said. Haddo's face did not for an instant change its expression. "And have you communicated your suspicions to the police?" "I propose to." "And if I am not indiscreet, may I inquire upon what you base them?" "I saw Margaret 3 weeks ago, and she told me that she went in terror of her life." "Poor Margaret! She had always the romantic temperament. I think it was that which first brought us together." "You damned scoundrel!" cried Arthur. "My dear fellow, pray moderate your language. This is surely not an occasion when you should give way to your lamentable taste for abuse. You outrage all Miss Boyd's susceptibilities." He turned to her with an airy wave of his fat hand. "You must forgive me if I do not offer you the hospitality of Skene, but the loss I have so lately sustained does not permit me to indulge in the levity of entertaining." He gave her an ironical low bow, then looked once more at Arthur. "If I can be of no further use to you, perhaps you would leave me to my own reflections. The lodge-keeper will give you the exact address of the village constable." Arthur did not answer. He stared into vacancy as if he were turning over things in his mind. Then he turned sharply on his heel and walked towards the gate. Susie and Dr. Porhoët, taken completely aback, did not know what to do, and Haddo's little eyes twinkled as he watched their discomfiture. "I always thought that your friend had deplorable manners," he murmured. Susie, feeling very ridiculous, flushed, and Dr. Porhoët awkwardly took off his hat. As they walked away, they felt Haddo's mocking gaze fixed upon them, and they were heartily thankful to reach the gate. They found Arthur waiting for them. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I forgot that I was not alone." The three of them drove slowly back to the inn. "What are you going to do now?" asked Susie. For a long time, Arthur made no reply, and Susie thought he could not have heard her. At last, he broke the silence. "I see that I can do nothing by ordinary methods. I realize that it is useless to make a public outcry. There is only my own conviction that Margaret came to a violent end, and I cannot expect anyone to pay heed to that. After all, it's just possible that she really died of heart disease." Arthur gave Susie a long look. He seemed to consider her words deliberately. "Perhaps there are means to decide that conclusively," he replied at length thoughtfully, as though he were talking to himself. "What are they?" Arthur did not answer. When they came to the door of the inn, he stopped. "Will you go in? I wish to take a walk by myself," he said. Susie looked at him anxiously. "You're not going to do anything rash?" "I will do nothing till I have made quite sure that Margaret was foully murdered." He turned on his heel and walked quickly away. It was late now, and they found a frugal meal waiting for them in the little sitting-room. It seemed no use to delay it till Arthur came back, and silently, sorrowfully, they ate. Afterwards the doctor smoked cigarettes, while Susie sat at the open window and looked at the stars. She thought of Margaret, of her beauty and her charming frankness, of her fall and of her miserable end, and she began to cry quietly. She knew enough of the facts now to be aware that the wretched girl was not to blame for anything that had happened. A cruel fate had fallen upon her, and she had been as powerless as in the old tales Phaedra, the daughter of Minos, or Mira of the beautiful hair. The hours passed, and still Arthur did not return. Susie thought now only of him, and she was frightfully anxious. But at last he came in. The night was far advanced. He put down his hat and sat down. For a long while he looked silently at Dr. Porhoët. "What is it, my friend?" asked the good doctor at length. "Do you remember that you told us once of an experiment you made in Alexandria?" he said, after some hesitation. He spoke in a curious voice. "You told us that you took a boy, and when he looked in a magic mirror, he saw things which he could not possibly have known." "I remember very well," said the doctor. "I was much inclined to laugh at you at the time. I was convinced that the boy was a knave who deceived you." "Yes?" "Of late I've thought of that story often. Some hidden recess of my memory has been opened, and I seem to remember strange things. Was I the boy who looked in the ink?" "Yes," said the doctor quietly. Arthur did not say anything. A profound silence fell upon them, while Susie and the doctor watched him intently. They wondered what was in his mind. "There is a side of my character which I did not know till lately," Arthur said at last. "When first it dawned upon me, I fought against it. I said to myself that deep down in all of us, a relic from the long past, is the remains of the superstition that blinded our fathers, and it is needful for the man of science to fight against it with all his might. And yet it was stronger than I. Perhaps my birth, my early years, in those eastern lands where everyone believes in the supernatural, affected me, although I did not know it. I began to remember vague, mysterious things, which I never knew had been part of my knowledge, and at last one day it seemed that a new window was opened onto my soul, and I saw with extraordinary clearness the incident which you had described. I knew suddenly it was part of my own experience. I saw you take me by the hand and pour the ink on my palm and bid me look at it. I felt again the strange glow that thrilled me, and with an indescribable bitterness I saw things in the mirror which were not there before. I saw people whom I had never seen. I saw them perform certain actions, and some force I knew not obliged me to speak, and at length everything grew dim, and I was as exhausted as if I had not eaten all day. He went over to the open window and looked out. Neither of the others spoke. The look on Arthur's face, curiously outlined by the light of the lamp, was very stern. He seemed to undergo some mental struggle of extraordinary violence. His breath came quickly. At last he turned and faced them. He spoke hoarsely, quickly. "I must see Margaret again." "Arthur, you're mad!" cried Susie. He went up to Dr. Porhoët and, putting his hands on his shoulders, looked fixedly into his eyes. "You have studied this science. You know all that can be known of it. I want you to show her to me." The doctor gave an exclamation of alarm. "My dear fellow, how can I? I have read many books, but I have never practiced anything. I have only studied these matters for my amusement. Do you believe it can be done? I don't understand what you want. I want you to bring her to me so that I may speak with her, so that I may find out the truth. Do you think I am God, that I can raise men from the dead?" Arthur's hands pressed him down in the chair from which he sought to rise. His fingers were clenched on the old man's shoulders, so that he could hardly bear the pain. "You told us how once Eliphas Levi raised a spirit. Do you believe that was true?" "I don't know. I have always kept an open mind. There was much to be said on both sides." "Well, now you must believe. You must do what he did." "You must be mad, Arthur." "I want you to come to that spot where I saw her last. If her spirit can be brought back anywhere, it must be in that place where she sat and wept. You know all the ceremonies and all the words that are necessary." But Susie came forward and laid her hand on his arm. He looked at her with a frown. "Arthur, you know in your heart that nothing can come of it. You're only increasing your unhappiness, and even if you could bring her from the grave for a moment, why can you not let her troubled soul rest in peace? If she died a natural death, we shall have no power over her, but if her death was violent, perhaps her spirit is earthbound still. I tell you I must be certain. I want to see her once more, and afterwards I shall know what to do." I cannot," said the doctor. "Give me the books, and I will do it alone." "You know that I have nothing here." "Then you must help me," said Arthur. "After all, why should you mind? We perform a certain operation, and if nothing happens, we are no worse off than before. On the other hand, if we succeed, oh, for God's sake, help me. If you have any care for my happiness, do this one thing for me." He stepped back and looked at the doctor. The Frenchman's eyes were fixed upon the ground. "It's madness," he muttered. He was intensely moved by Arthur's appeal. At last he shrugged his shoulders. "After all, if it is but a foolish mummery, it can do no harm." "You will help me?" cried Arthur. "If it can give you any peace or any satisfaction, I am willing to do what I can. But I warn you to be prepared for a great disappointment." Chapter 15. Arthur wished to set about the invocation then and there, but Dr. Porhoët said it was impossible. They were all exhausted after the long journey, and it was necessary to get certain things together without which nothing could be done. In his heart he thought that a night's rest would bring Arthur to a more reasonable mind. When the light of day shone upon the earth, he would be ashamed of the desire which ran counter to all his prepossessions. But Arthur remembered that on the next day it would be exactly a week since Margaret's death, and it seemed to him that then their spells might have a greater efficacy. When they came down in the morning and greeted one another, it was plain that none of them had slept. "Are you still of the same purpose as last night?" asked Dr. Porhoët gravely. "I am." The doctor hesitated nervously. "It will be necessary, if you wish to follow out the rules of the old necromancers, to fast through the whole day." "I am ready to do anything." "It will be no hardship to me," said Susie, with a little hysterical laugh. "I feel I couldn't eat a thing if I tried." "I think the whole affair is sheer folly," said Dr. Porhoët. "You promised me you would try." The day, the long summer day, passed slowly. There was a hard brilliancy in the sky that reminded the Frenchman of those Egyptian heavens when the earth seemed crushed beneath a bowl of molten fire. Arthur was too restless to remain indoors and left the others to their own devices. He walked without aim as fast as he could go. He felt no weariness. The burning sun beat down upon him, but he did not know it. The hours passed with lagging feet. Susie lay on her bed and tried to read. Her nerves were so taut that when there was a sound in the courtyard of a pail falling on the cobbles, she cried out in terror. The sun rose, and presently her window was flooded with quivering rays of gold. It was midday. The day passed, and it was afternoon. The evening came, but it brought no freshness. Meanwhile, Dr. Porhoët sat in the little parlour, with his head between his hands, trying by a great mental effort to bring back to his memory all that he had read. His heart began to beat more quickly. Then the night fell, and one by one the stars shone out. There was no wind. The air was heavy. Susie came downstairs and began to talk with Dr. Porhoët, but they spoke in a low tone, as if they were afraid that someone would overhear. They were faint now with want of food. The hours went one by one, and the striking of a clock filled them each time with a mysterious apprehension. The lights in the village were put out little by little, and everybody slept. Susie had lighted the lamp, and they watched beside it. A cold shiver passed through her. "I feel as though someone were lying dead in the room," she said. "Why does not Arthur come?" They spoke inconsequently, and neither heeded what the other said. The window was wide open, but the air was difficult to breathe, and now the silence was so unusual that Susie grew strangely nervous. She tried to think of the noisy streets in Paris, the constant roar of traffic, and the shuffling of the crowds toward evening as the work-people returned to their homes. She stood up. "There's no air tonight. Look at the trees. Not a leaf is moving." "Why does not Arthur come?" repeated the doctor. "There's no moon tonight. It will be very dark at Skene. He's walked all day. He should be here by now." Susie felt an extraordinary oppression, and she panted for breath. At last they heard a step on the road outside, and Arthur stood at the window. "Are you ready to come?" he said. "We've been waiting for you." They joined him, bringing the few things that Dr. Porhoët had said were necessary, and they walked along the solitary road that led to Skene. On each side, the heather stretched into the dark night, and there was a blackness about it that was ominous. There was no sound save that of their own steps. Dimly, under the stars, they saw the desolation with which they were surrounded. The way seemed very long. They were utterly exhausted, and they could hardly drag one foot after the other. "You must let me rest for a minute," said Susie. They did not answer, but stopped, and she sat on a boulder by the wayside. They stood motionless in front of her, waiting patiently till she was ready. After a little while, she forced herself to get up. Now I can go, she said. Still they did not speak, but walked on. They moved like figures in a dream, with a stealthy directness, as though they acted under the influence of another's will. Suddenly, the road stopped, and they found themselves at the gates of Skene. "Follow me very closely," said Arthur. He turned on one side, and they followed a paling. Susie could feel that they walked along a narrow path. She could see hardly 2 steps in front of her. At last he stood still. "I came here earlier in the night and made the opening easier to get through." He turned back a broken piece of railing and slipped in. Susie followed, and Dr. Porhoët entered after her. "I can see nothing," said Susie. "Give me your hand, and I will lead you." And they walked with difficulty through the tangled bracken among closely planted trees. They stumbled, and once Dr. Porhoët fell. It seemed that they went a long way. Susie's heart beat fast with anxiety. All her weariness was forgotten. Then Arthur stopped them, and he pointed in front of him. Through an opening in the trees, they saw the house. All the windows were dark, except those just under the roof, and from them came bright lights. "Those are the attics which he uses as a laboratory. You see, he is working now. There is no one else in the house." Susie was curiously fascinated by the flaming lights. There was an awful mystery in those unknown labours which absorbed Oliver Haddo night after night till the sun rose. What horrible things were done there, hidden from the eyes of men. By himself in that vast house, the madman performed ghastly experiments, and who could tell what dark secrets he trafficked in? "There is no danger that he will come out," said Arthur. "He remains there till the break of day." He took her hand again and led her on. Back they went among the trees, and presently they were on a pathway. They walked along with greater safety. "Are you all right, Porhoët?" asked Arthur. "Yes." But the trees grew thicker and the night more sombre. Now the stars were shut out, and they could hardly see in front of them. "Here we are," said Arthur. They stopped and found that there was in front of them a green space formed by 4 crossways. In the middle, a stone bench gleamed vaguely against the darkness. "This is where Margaret sat when last I saw her." "I can see to do nothing here," said the doctor. They had brought 2 flat bowls of brass to serve as censers, and these Arthur gave to Dr. Porhoët. He stood by Susie's side while the doctor busied himself with his preparations. They saw him move to and fro. They saw him bend to the ground. Presently there was a crackling of wood, and from the brazen bowls red flames shot up. They did not know what he burnt, but there were heavy clouds of smoke, and a strong aromatic odour filled the air. Now and again the doctor was sharply silhouetted against the light. His slight, bowed figure was singularly mysterious. When Susie caught sight of his face, she saw that it was touched with a strong emotion. The work he was at affected him so that his doubts, his fears had vanished. He looked like some old alchemist, busied with unnatural things. Susie's heart began to beat painfully. She was growing desperately frightened and stretched out her hand so that she might touch Arthur. Silently, he put his arm through hers, and now the doctor was tracing strange signs upon the ground. The flames died down, and only a glow remained, but he seemed to have no difficulty in seeing what he was about. Susie could not discern what figures he drew. Then he put more twigs upon the braziers, and the flames sprang up once more, cutting the darkness sharply as with a sword. "Now come," he said. But inexplicably, a sudden terror seized Susie. She felt that the hairs of her head stood up, and a cold sweat broke out on her body. Her limbs had grown on an instant inconceivably heavy, so that she could not move. A panic, such as she had never known, came upon her, and except that her legs would not carry her, she would have fled blindly. She began to tremble. She tried to speak, but her tongue clave to her throat. "I can't, I'm afraid," she muttered hoarsely. You must. Without you, we can do nothing, said Arthur. She could not reason with herself. She had forgotten everything except that she was frightened to death. Her heart was beating so quickly that she almost fainted. And now Arthur held her, so firmly that she winced. "Let me go," she whispered. "I won't help you. I'm afraid." "You must," he said. "You must." "No. I tell you, you must come." "Why?" Her deadly fear expressed itself in a passion of sudden anger. "Because you love me, and it's the only way to give me peace." She uttered a low wail of pain, and her terror gave way to shame. She blushed to the roots of her hair because he too knew her secret. And then she was seized again with anger because he had the cruelty to taunt her with it. She had recovered her courage now, and she stepped forward. Dr. Porhoët told her where to stand. Arthur took his place in front of her. "You must not move till I give you leave. If you go outside the figure I have drawn, I cannot protect you." For a moment, Dr. Porhoët stood in perfect silence. Then he began to recite strange words in Latin. Susie heard him but vaguely. She did not know the sense, and his voice was so low that she could not have distinguished the words. But his intonation had lost that gentle irony which was habitual to him, and he spoke with a trembling gravity that was extraordinarily impressive. Arthur stood immobile as a rock. The flames died away, and they saw one another only by the glow of the ashes, dimly, like persons in a vision of death. There was silence. Then the necromancer spoke again, and now his voice was louder. He seemed to utter weird invocations, but they were in a tongue that the others knew not. And while he spoke, the light from the burning cinders on a sudden went out. It did not die, but was sharply extinguished, as though by invisible hands. And now the darkness was more sombre than that of the blackest night. The trees that surrounded them were hidden from their eyes, and the whiteness of the stone bench was seen no longer. They stood but a little way one from the other, but each might have stood alone. Susie strained her eyes, but she could see nothing. She looked up quickly. The stars were gone out, and she could see no further over her head than round about. The darkness was terrifying, and from it, Dr. Porhoët's voice had a ghastly effect. It seemed to come, wonderfully changed, from the void of bottomless chaos. Susie clenched her hands so that she might not faint. All at once she started, for the old man's voice was cut by a sudden gust of wind. A moment before, the utter silence had been almost intolerable, and now a storm seemed to have fallen upon them. The trees, all around them, rocked in the wind. They heard the branches creak, and they heard the hissing of the leaves. They were in the midst of a hurricane, and they felt the earth sway as it resisted the straining roots of great trees, which seemed to be dragged up by the force of the furious gale. Whistling and roaring, the wind stormed all about them, and the doctor, raising his voice, tried in vain to command it. But the strangest thing of all was that, where they stood, there was no sign of the raging blast. The air immediately about them was as still as it had been before, and not a hair on Susie's head was moved. And it was terrible to hear the tumult, and yet to be in a calm that was almost unnatural. On a sudden, Dr. Porhoët raised his voice, and with a sternness they had never heard in it before, cried out in that unknown language. Then he called upon Margaret. He called her name 3 times. In the uproar, Susie could scarcely hear. Terror had seized her again, but in her confusion she remembered his command, and she dared not move. "Margaret, Margaret, Margaret." Without a pause between, as quickly as a stone falls to the ground, the din, which was all about them, ceased. There was no gradual diminution. But at one moment there was a roaring hurricane, and at the next a silence so complete that it might have been the silence of death. And then, seeming to come out of nothingness extraordinarily, they heard with a curious distinctness the sound of a woman weeping. Susie's heart stood still. They heard the sound of a woman weeping, and they recognized the voice of Margaret. A groan of anguish burst from Arthur's lips, and he was on the point of starting forward. But quickly, Dr. Porhoët put out his hand to prevent him. The sound was heart-rending, the sobbing of a woman who had lost all hope, the sobbing of a woman terrified. If Susie had been able to stir, she would have put her hands to her ears to shut out the ghastly agony of it. And in a moment, notwithstanding the heavy darkness of the starless night, Arthur saw her. She was seated on the stone bench as when last he had spoken with her. In her anguish, she sought not to hide her face. She looked at the ground, and the tears fell down her cheeks. Her bosom heaved with the pain of her weeping. Then Arthur knew that all his suspicions were justified. Chapter 16 and the conclusion. Arthur would not leave the little village of Venning. Neither Susie nor the doctor could get him to make any decision. None of them spoke of the night which they had spent in the woods of Skene, but it coloured all their thoughts, and they were not free for a single moment from the ghastly memory of it. They seemed still to hear the sound of that passionate weeping. Arthur was moody. When he was with them, he spoke little. He opposed a stubborn resistance to their efforts at diverting his mind. He spent long hours by himself, in the country, and they had no idea what he did. Susie was terribly anxious. He had lost his balance so completely that she was prepared for any rashness. She divined that his hatred of Haddo was no longer within the bounds of reason. The desire for vengeance filled him entirely, so that he was capable of any violence. Several days went by. At last, in concert with Dr. Porhoët, she determined to make one more attempt. It was late at night, and they sat with open windows in the sitting-room of the inn. There was a singular oppressiveness in the air which suggested that a thunderstorm was at hand. Susie prayed for it, for she ascribed to the peculiar heat of the last few days much of Arthur's sullen irritability. "Arthur, you must tell us what you're going to do," she said. "It is useless to stay here. We are all so ill and nervous that we cannot consider anything rationally. We want you to come away with us tomorrow." "You can go if you choose," he said. "I shall remain till that man is dead." "It is madness to talk like that. You can do nothing. You are only making yourself worse by staying here." "I have quite made up my mind. The law can offer you no help, and what else can you do?" She asked the question, meaning, if possible, to get from him some hint of his intentions. But the grimness of his answer, though it only confirmed her vague suspicions, startled her. "If I can do nothing else, I shall shoot him like a dog." She could think of nothing to say, and for a while they remained in silence. Then he got up. "I think I should prefer it if you went," he said. "You can only hamper me." "I shall stay here as long as you do." "Why?" "Because if you do anything, I shall be compromised. I may be arrested. I think the fear of that may restrain you." He looked at her steadily. She met his eyes with a calmness which showed that she meant exactly what she said, and he turned uneasily away. A silence even greater than before fell upon them. They did not move. It was so still in the room that it might have been empty. The breathlessness of the air increased, so that it was horribly oppressive. Suddenly there was a loud rattle of thunder, and a flash of lightning tore across the heavy clouds. Susie thanked heaven for the storm, which would give presently a welcome freshness. She felt excessively ill at ease, and it was a relief to ascribe her sensation to a state of the atmosphere. Again the thunder rolled. It was so loud that it seemed to be immediately above their heads, and the wind rose suddenly and swept with a long moan through the trees that surrounded the house. It was a sound so human that it might have come from the souls of dead men suffering hopeless torments of regret. The lamp went out, so suddenly that Susie was vaguely frightened. It gave one flicker, and they were in total darkness. It seemed as though someone had leaned over the chimney and blown it out. The night was very black, and they could not see the window which opened onto the country. The darkness was so peculiar that for a moment no one stirred. Then Susie heard Dr. Porhoët slip his hand across the table to find matches, but it seemed that they were not there. Again a loud peal of thunder startled them, but the rain would not fall. They panted for fresh air. On a sudden, Susie's heart gave a bound, and she sprang up. "There's someone in the room." The words were no sooner out of her mouth than she heard Arthur fling himself upon the intruder. She knew at once, with the certainty of an intuition, that it was Haddo. But how had he come in? What did he want? She tried to cry out, but no sound came from her throat. Dr. Porhoët seemed bound to his chair. He did not move. He made no sound. She knew that an awful struggle was proceeding. It was a struggle to the death between two men who hated one another, but the most terrible part of it was that nothing was heard. They were perfectly noiseless. She tried to do something, but she could not stir. And Arthur's heart exulted, for his enemy was in his grasp under his hands, and he would not let him go while life was in him. He clenched his teeth and tightened his straining muscles. Susie heard his labored breathing, but she only heard the breathing of one man. She wondered in abject terror what that could mean. They struggled silently, hand to hand, and Arthur knew that his strength was greater. He had made up his mind what to do and directed all his energy to a definite end. His enemy was extraordinarily powerful, but Arthur appeared to create some strength from the sheer force of his will. It seemed for hours that they struggled. He could not bear him down. Suddenly, he knew that the other was frightened and sought to escape from him. Arthur tightened his grasp. For nothing in the world now would he ever loosen his hold. He took a deep, quick breath and then put out all his strength in a tremendous effort. They swayed from side to side. Arthur felt as if his muscles were being torn from the bones. He could not continue for more than a moment longer. But the agony that flashed across his mind at the thought of failure braced him to a sudden, angry jerk. All at once Haddo collapsed, and they fell heavily to the ground. Arthur was breathing more quickly now. He thought that if he could keep on for one instant longer, he would be safe. He threw all his weight on the form that rolled beneath him and bore down furiously on the man's arm. He twisted it sharply with all his might and felt it give way. He gave a low cry of triumph. The arm was broken, and now his enemy was seized with panic. He struggled madly. He wanted only to get away from those long hands that were killing him. They seemed to be of iron. Arthur seized the huge bullock throat and dug his fingers into it, and they sunk into the heavy rolls of fat, and he flung the whole weight of his body into them. He exulted, for he knew that his enemy was in his power at last. He was strangling him, strangling the life out of him. He wanted light so that he might see the horror of that vast face and the deadly fear and the staring eyes. And still he pressed with those iron hands. And now the movements were strangely convulsive. His victim writhed in the agony of death. His struggles were desperate, but the avenging hands held him as in a vice. And then the movements grew spasmodic, and then they grew weaker. Still the hands pressed upon the gigantic throat, and Arthur forgot everything. He was mad with rage and fury and hate and sorrow. He thought of Margaret's anguish and of her fiendish torture, and he wished the man had 10 lives so that he might take them one by one. And at last all was still, and that vast mass of flesh was motionless, and he knew that his enemy was dead. He loosened his grasp and slipped one hand over the heart. It would never beat again. The man was stone dead. Arthur got up and straightened himself. The darkness was intense still. and he could see nothing. Susie heard him, and at length she was able to speak. "Arthur, what have you done?" "I've killed him," he said hoarsely. "Oh, God, what shall we do?" Arthur began to laugh aloud, hysterically, and in the darkness his hilarity was terrifying. "For God's sake, let us have some light." "I've found the matches," said Dr. Porhoët. He seemed to awake suddenly from his long stupor. He struck one, and it would not light. He struck another, and Susie took off the globe and the chimney as he kindled the wick. Then he held up the lamp, and they saw Arthur looking at them. His face was ghastly. The sweat ran off his forehead in great beads, and his eyes were bloodshot. He trembled in every limb. Then Dr. Porhoët advanced with the lamp and held it forward. They looked down on the floor for the man who lay there dead. Susie gave a sudden cry of horror. There was no one there. Arthur stepped back in terrified surprise. There was no one in the room, living or dead, but the three friends. The ground sank under Susie's feet. She felt horribly ill, and she fainted. When she awoke, seeming difficultly to emerge from an eternal night, Arthur was holding down her head. "Bend down," he said. "Bend down." All that had happened came back to her, and she burst into tears. Her self-control deserted her, and clinging to him for protection, she sobbed as though her heart would break. She was shaking from head to foot. The strangeness of this last horror had overcome her, and she could have shrieked with fright. "It's all right," he said. "You need not be afraid." "Oh, what does it mean?" "You must pluck up courage. We're going now to Skene." She sprang to her feet as though to get away from him. Her heart beat wildly. "No, I can't. I'm frightened." "We must see what it means. We have no time to lose, or the morning will be upon us before we get back." Then she sought to prevent him. "Oh, for God's sake, don't go, Arthur. Something awful may await you there. Don't risk your life." "There is no danger. I tell you the man is dead." "If anything happened to you—" She stopped, trying to restrain her sobs. She dared not go on, but he seemed to know what was in her mind. "I will take no risks because of you. I know that whether I live or die is not a matter of indifference to you." She looked up and saw that his eyes were fixed upon her gravely. She reddened. A curious feeling came into her heart. "I will go with you wherever you choose," she said humbly. "Come, then." They stepped out into the night, and now, without rain, the storm had passed away, and the stars were shining. They walked quickly. Arthur went in front of them. Dr. Porhoët and Susie followed him side by side, and they had to hasten their steps in order not to be left behind. It seemed to them that the horror of the night was past, and there was a fragrancy in the air which was wonderfully refreshing. The sky was beautiful, and at last they came to Skene. Arthur led them again to the opening in the palisade, and he took Susie's hand. Presently they stood in the place from which a few days before they had seen the house. As then, it stood in massive blackness against the night, and as then, the attic windows shone out with brilliant lights. Susie started, for she had expected that the whole place would be in darkness. "There is no danger, I promise you," said Arthur gently. "We are going to find out the meaning of all this mystery." He began to walk towards the house. "Have you a weapon of some sort?" asked the doctor. Arthur handed him a revolver. "Take this. It will reassure you, but you will have no need of it. I bought it the other day when I had other plans." Susie gave a little shudder. They reached the drive and walked to the great portico which adorned the facade of the house. Arthur tried the handle, but it would not open. "Will you wait here?" he said. "I can get through one of the windows, and I will let you in." He left them. They stood quietly there, with anxious hearts. They could not guess what they would see. They were afraid that something would happen to Arthur, and Susie regretted that she had not insisted on going with him. Suddenly, she remembered that awful moment when the light of the lamp had been thrown where all expected to see a body, and there was nothing. "What do you think it meant?" she cried suddenly. "What is the explanation?" "Perhaps we shall see now," answered the doctor. Arthur still lingered, and she could not imagine what had become of him. All sorts of horrible fancies passed through her mind, and she dreaded she knew not what. At last, they heard a footstep inside the house, and the door was opened. I was convinced that nobody slept here, but I was obliged to make sure. I had some difficulty in getting in. Susie hesitated to enter. She did not know what horrors awaited her, and the darkness was terrifying. "I cannot see," she said. "I've brought a torch," said Arthur. He pressed a button, and a narrow ray of bright light was cast upon the floor. Dr. Porhoët and Susie went in. Arthur carefully closed the door and flashed the light of his torch all round them. They stood in a large hall, the floor of which was scattered with the skins of lions that Haddo on his celebrated expedition had killed in Africa. There were perhaps a dozen, and their number gave a wild, barbaric note. A great oak staircase led to the upper floors. "We must go through all the rooms," said Arthur. He did not expect to find Haddo till they came to the lighted attics, but it seemed needful, nevertheless, to pass right through the house on their way. A flash of his torch had shown him that the walls of the hall were decorated with all manner of armor, ancient swords of Eastern handiwork, barbaric weapons from Central Africa, savage implements of medieval warfare, and an idea came to him. He took down a huge battle-axe and swung it in his hand. "Now come!" Silently, holding their breath as though they feared to wake the dead, they went into the first room. They saw it difficultly with their scant light, since the thin shaft of brilliancy, emphasizing acutely the surrounding darkness, revealed it only piece by piece. It was a large room, evidently unused, for the furniture was covered with holland, and there was a mustiness about it which suggested that the windows were seldom opened. As in many old houses, the rooms led not from a passage but into one another, and they walked through many till they came back into the hall. They had all a desolate, uninhabited air. Their somberness was increased by the oak with which they were panelled. There was panelling in the hall, too, and on the stairs that led broadly to the top of the house. As they ascended, Arthur stopped for one moment and passed his hand over the polished wood. "It would burn like tinder," he said, and they went through the rooms on the first floor, and they were as empty and as cheerless. Presently they came to that which had been Margaret's. In a bowl were dead flowers. Her brushes were still on the toilet table, but it was a gloomy chamber with its dark oak, and so comfortless that Susie shuddered. Arthur stood for a time and looked at it, but he said nothing. They found themselves again on the stairs, and they went to the second story. But here they seemed to be at the top of the house. "How does one get up to the attics?" said Arthur, looking about him with surprise. He paused for a while to think. Then he nodded his head. "There must be some steps leading out of one of the rooms." They went on, and now the ceilings were much lower, with heavy beams, and there was no furniture at all. The emptiness seemed to make everything more terrifying. They felt that they were on the threshold of a great mystery, and Susie's heart began to beat fast. Arthur conducted his examination with the greatest method. He walked round each room carefully, looking for a door that might lead to a staircase, but there was no sign of one. "What will you do if you can't find the way up?" asked Susie. "I shall find the way up," he answered. They came to the staircase once more, and had discovered nothing. They looked at one another helplessly. "It's quite clear there is a way," said Arthur, with impatience. "There must be something in the nature of a hidden door somewhere or other." He leaned against the balustrade and meditated. The light of his lantern through a narrow ray upon the opposite wall. "I feel certain it must be in one of the rooms at the end of the house. That seems the most natural place to put a means of ascent to the attics." They went back, and again he examined the panelling of a small room that had outside walls on 3 sides of it. It was the only room that did not lead into another. "It must be here," he said. Presently he gave a little laugh, for he saw that a small door was concealed by the woodwork. He pressed it where he thought there might be a spring, and it flew open. Their torch showed them a narrow wooden staircase. They walked up and found themselves in front of a door. Arthur tried it, but it was locked. He smiled grimly. "Will you get back a little?" he said. He lifted his axe and swung it down upon the latch. The handle was shattered, but the lock did not yield. He shook his head. As he paused for a moment, and there was a complete silence, Susie distinctly heard a slight noise. She put her hand on Arthur's arm to call his attention to it, and with strained ears they listened. There was something alive on the other side of the door. They heard its curious sound. It was not that of a human voice. It was not the crying of an animal. It was extraordinary. It was the sort of gibber, hoarse and rapid, and it filled them with an icy terror because it was so weird and so unnatural. "Come away, Arthur," said Susie. "Come away." "There's some living thing in there," he answered. He did not know why the sound horrified him. The sweat broke out on his forehead. "Something awful will happen to us," whispered Susie, shaking with uncontrollable fear. "The only thing is to break the door down." The horrid gibbering was drowned by the noise he made. Quickly, without pausing, he began to hack at the oak door with all his might. In rapid succession, his heavy blows rained down, and the sound echoed through the empty house. There was a crash, and the door swung back. They had been so long in almost total darkness that they were blinded for an instant by the dazzling light. And then, instinctively, they started back, for as the door opened, a wave of heat came out upon them so that they could hardly breathe. The place was like an oven. They entered. It was lit by enormous lamps, the light of which was increased by reflectors and warmed by a great furnace. They could not understand why so intense a heat was necessary. The narrow windows were closed. Dr. Porhoët caught sight of a thermometer and was astounded at the temperature it indicated. The room was used evidently as a laboratory. On broad tables were test tubes, basins and baths of white porcelain, measuring glasses and utensils of all sorts. But the surprising thing was the great scale upon which everything was. Neither Arthur nor Dr. Porhoët had ever seen such gigantic measures nor such large test tubes. There were rows of bottles, like those in the dispensary of a hospital, each containing great quantities of a different chemical. The three friends stood in silence. The emptiness of the room contrasted so oddly with its appearance of being in immediate use that it was uncanny. Susie felt that he who worked there was in the midst of his labors and might return at any moment. He could have only gone for an instant into another chamber in order to see the progress of some experiment. It was quite silent. Whatever had made those vague, unearthly noises was hushed by their approach. The door was closed between this room and the next. Arthur opened it, and they found themselves in a long, low attic, sealed with great rafters, as brilliantly lit and as hot as the first. Here, too, were broad tables laden with retorts, instruments for heating, huge test tubes, and all manner of vessels. The furnace that warmed it gave a steady heat. Arthur's gaze travelled slowly from table to table, and he wondered what Haddo's experiments had really been. The air was heavy with an extraordinary odour. It was not musty, like that of the closed rooms through which they had passed, but singularly pungent, disagreeable, and sickly. He asked himself what it could spring from. Then his eyes fell upon a huge receptacle that stood on the table nearest to the furnace. It was covered with a white cloth. He took it off. The vessel was about 4 feet high, round, and shaped somewhat like a washing tub, but it was made of glass, more than an inch thick. In it, a spherical mass, a little larger than a football, of a peculiar, livid color. The surface was smooth, but rather coarsely grained, and over it ran a dense system of blood vessels. It reminded the two medical men of those huge tumors which are preserved in spirit in hospital museums. Susie looked at it with an incomprehensible disgust. Suddenly, she gave a cry. "Good God, it's moving!" Arthur put his hand on her arm quickly to quieten her and bent down with irresistible curiosity. They saw that it was a mass of flesh, unlike that of any human being, and it pulsated regularly. The movement was quite distinct, up and down, like the delicate heaving of a woman's breast when she is asleep. Arthur touched the thing with one finger, and it shrank slightly. "It's quite warm," he said. He turned it over, and it remained in the position in which he had placed it, as if there were neither top nor bottom to it. But they could see now, irregularly placed on one side, a few short hairs. They were just like human hairs. "Is it alive?" whispered Susie, struck with horror and amazement. "Yes!" Arthur seemed fascinated. He could not take his eyes off the loathsome thing. He watched it slowly heave with even motion. "What can it mean?" he asked. He looked at Dr. Porhoët with pale, startled face. A thought was coming to him, but a thought so unnatural, extravagant, and terrible that he pushed it from him with a movement of both hands, as though it were a material thing. Then all three turned around abruptly with a start, for they heard again the wild gibbering which had first shocked their ears. In the wonder of this revolting object, they had forgotten all the rest. The sound seemed extraordinarily near, and Susie drew back instinctively, for it appeared to come from her very side. "There's nothing here," said Arthur. "It must be in the next room." "Oh, Arthur, let us go," cried Susie. "I'm afraid to see what may be in store for us. It is nothing to us, and what we see may poison our sleep forever." She looked appealingly at Dr. Porhoët. He was white and anxious. The heat of that place had made the sweat break out on his forehead. "I have seen enough. I want to see no more," he said. "Then you may go, both of you," answered Arthur. "I do not wish to force you to see anything, but I shall go on. Whatever it is, I wish to find out." "But Haddo? Supposing he is there, waiting? Perhaps you are only walking into a trap that he has set for you." "I am convinced that Haddo is dead." Again, that unintelligible jargon, unhuman and shrill, fell upon their ears, and Arthur stepped forward. Susie did not hesitate. She was prepared to follow him anywhere. He opened the door, and there was a sudden quiet. Whatever made those sounds was there. It was a larger room than any on the others, and much higher, for it ran along the whole front of the house. The powerful lamps showed every corner of it at once, but above, the beams of the open ceiling were dark with shadow. And here the nauseous odor, which had struck them before, was so overpowering that for a while they could not go in. It was indescribably foul. Even Arthur thought it would make him sick, and he looked at the windows to see if it was possible to open them, but it seemed they were hermetically closed. The extreme warmth made the air more overpowering. There were 4 furnaces here, and they were all alight. In order to give out more heat and to burn slowly, the fronts of them were open, and one could see that they were filled with glowing coke. The room was furnished no differently from the others, but to the various instruments for chemical operations on a large scale were added all manner of electrical appliances. Several books were lying about, and one had been left open face downwards on the edge of a table. But what immediately attracted their attention was a row of those large glass vessels, like that which they had seen in the adjoining room. Each was covered with a white cloth. They hesitated a moment, for they knew that here they were face to face with the great enigma. At last, Arthur pulled away the cloth from one. None of them spoke. They stared with astonished eyes. For here, too, was a strange mass of flesh, almost as large as a newborn child, but there was in it the beginnings of something ghastly human. It was shaped vaguely like an infant, but the legs were joined together so that it looked like a mummy rolled up in its coverings. There were neither feet nor knees. The trunk was formless, but there was a curious thickening on each side. It was as if a modeler had meant to make a figure with the arms loosely bent, but had left the work unfinished so that they were still one with the body. There was something that resembled a human head, covered with long golden hair, but it was horrible. It was an uncouth mass, without eyes or nose or mouth. The color was a kind of sickly pink, and it was almost transparent. There was a very slight movement in it, rhythmical and slow. It was living, too. Then quickly Arthur removed the covering from all the other jars but one, and in a flash of the eyes they saw abominations so awful that Susie had to clench her fists in order not to scream. There was one monstrous thing in which the limbs approached nearly to the human. It was extraordinarily heaped up, with fat, tiny arms, little bloated legs, and an absurd squat body, so that it looked like a Chinese mandarin in porcelain. In another, the trunk was almost like that of a human child, except that it was patched strangely with red and grey. But the terror of it was that at the neck it branched hideously, and there were two distinct heads, monstrously large, but duly provided with all their features. The features were a caricature of humanity so shameful that one could hardly bear to look. And as the light fell on it, the eyes of each head opened slowly. They had no pigment in them, but were pink, like the eyes of white rabbits, and they stared for a moment with an odd, unseeing glance. Then they were shut again, and what was curiously terrifying was that the movements were not quite simultaneous. The eyelids of one head fell slowly just before those of the other. And in another place was a ghastly monster in which it seemed that two bodies had been dreadfully entangled with one another. It was a creature of nightmare, with 4 arms and 4 legs, and this one actually moved. With a peculiar motion, it crawled along the bottom of the great receptacle in which it was kept, towards the 3 persons who looked at it. It seemed to wonder what they did. Susie started back with fright as it raised itself on its 4 legs and tried to reach up to them. Susie turned away and hid her face. She could not look at those ghastly counterfeits of humanity. She was terrified and ashamed. "Do you understand what this means?" said Dr. Porhoët to Arthur in an awed voice. "It means that he has discovered the secret of life." Was it for these vile monstrosities that Margaret was sacrificed in all her loveliness? The 2 men looked at one another with sad, wondering eyes. "Don't you remember that he talked of the manufacture of human beings? It's these misshapen things that he's succeeding in producing," said the doctor. "There is one more that we haven't seen," said Arthur. He pointed to the covering which still hid the largest of the vases. He had a feeling that it contained the most fearful of all these monsters, and it was not without an effort that he drew the cloth away. But no sooner had he done this than something sprang up, so that instinctively he started back, and it began to gibber in piercing tones. These were the unearthly sounds that they had heard. It was not a voice. It was a kind of raucous crying, hoarse yet shrill, uneven like the barking of a dog, and appalling. The sounds came forth in rapid succession, angrily, as though the being that uttered them sought to express itself in furious words. It was mad with passion and beat against the glass walls of its prison with clenched fists. For the hands were human hands, and the body, though much larger, was of the shape of a newborn child. The creature must have stood about 4 feet high. The head was horribly misshapen. The skull was enormous, smooth and distended like that of a hydrocephalic, and the forehead protruded over the face hideously. The features were almost unformed, preternaturally small under the great overhanging brow, and they had an expression of fiendish malignity. The tiny, misshapen countenance writhed with convulsive fury, and from the mouth poured out a foaming spume. It raised its voice higher and higher, shrieking senseless gibberish in its rage. Then it began to hurl its whole body madly against the glass walls and to beat its head. It appeared to have a sudden, incomprehensible hatred for the three strangers. It was trying to fly at them. The toothless gums moved spasmodically, and it threw its face into horrible grimaces. That nameless, loathsome abortion was the nearest that Oliver Haddo had come to the human form. "Come away," said Arthur. "We must not look at this." He quickly flung the covering over the jar. "Yes, for God's sake, let us go," said Susie. "We haven't done yet," answered Arthur. "We haven't found the author of all this." He looked at the room in which they were, but there was no door except that by which they had entered. Then he uttered a startled cry, and stepping forward, fell on his knee. On the other side of the long tables, heaped up with instruments, hidden so that at first they had not seen him, Oliver Haddo lay on the floor, dead. His blue eyes were staring wide, and they seemed larger than they had ever been. They kept still the expression of terror which they had worn in the moment of his agony, and his heavy face was distorted with deadly fear. It was purple and dark, and the eyes were injected with blood. "He died of suffocation," whispered Dr. Porhoët. Arthur pointed to the neck. There could be seen on it distinctly the marks of the avenging fingers that had strangled the life out of him. It was impossible to hesitate. "I told you that I had killed him," said Arthur. Then he remembered something more. He took hold of the right arm. He was convinced that it had been broken during that desperate struggle in the darkness. He felt it carefully and listened. He heard plainly the two parts of the bone rub against one another. The dead man's arm was broken just in the place where he had broken it. Arthur stood up. He took one last look at his enemy. That vast mass of flesh lay heaped up on the floor in horrible disorder. "Now that you have seen, will you come away?" said Susie, interrupting him. The words seemed to bring him suddenly to himself. "Yes, we must go quickly." And they turned away and with hurried steps walked through those bright attics till they came to the stairs. "Now go down and wait for me at the door," said Arthur. "I will follow you immediately." "What are you going to do?" asked Susie. "Never mind, do as I tell you. I have not finished here yet." They went down the great oak staircase and waited in the hall. They wondered what Arthur was about. Presently he came running down. "Be quick," he cried. "We have no time to lose." "What have you done, Arthur?" "There's no time to tell you now." He hurried them out and slammed the door behind him. He took Susie's hand. "Now we must run. Come." She did not know what his haste signified, but her heart beat furiously. He dragged her along. Dr. Porhoët hurried on behind them. Arthur plunged into the wood. He would not leave them time to breathe. "You must be quick," he said. At last they came to the opening in the fence, and he helped them to get through. Then he carefully replaced the wooden paling, and taking Susie's arm began to walk rapidly towards their inn. "I'm frightfully tired," she said. "I simply can't go so fast." "You must. Presently you can rest as long as you like." They walked very quickly for a while. Now and then Arthur looked back. The night was still quite dark, and the stars shone out in their myriads. At last he slackened their pace. "Now you can go more slowly," he said. Susie saw the smiling glance that he gave her. His eyes were full of tenderness. He put his arm affectionately round her shoulders to support her. I'm afraid you're quite exhausted, poor thing, he said. I'm sorry to have had to hustle you so much. It doesn't matter at all. She leaned against him comfortably. With that protecting arm about her, she felt capable of any fatigue. Dr. Porhoët stopped. You must really let me roll myself a cigarette, he said. You may do whatever you like, answered Arthur. There was a different ring in his voice now, and it was soft, with a good humour that they had not heard in it for many months. He appeared singularly relieved. Susie was ready to forget the terrible past and give herself over to the happiness that seemed at last in store for her. They began to saunter slowly on, and now they could take pleasure in the exquisite night. The air was very suave, odorous with the heather that was all about them, and there was an enchanting peace in that scene which wonderfully soothed their weariness. It was dark still, but they knew the dawn was at hand, and Susie rejoiced in the approaching day. In the east, the azure of the night began to thin away into pale amethyst, and the trees seemed gradually to stand out from the darkness in a ghostly beauty. Suddenly birds began to sing all around them in a splendid chorus. From their feet a lark sprang up with a rustle of wings, and mounting proudly upon the air, chanted blithe canticles to greet the morning. They stood upon a little hill. "Let us wait here and see the sun rise," said Susie. "As you will." They stood all three of them, and Susie took in deep, joyful breaths of the sweet air of dawn. The whole land spread at her feet was clothed in the purple dimness that heralds day, and she exulted in its beauty. But she noticed that Arthur, unlike herself and Dr. Porhoët, did not look toward the east. His eyes were fixed steadily upon the place from which they had come. What did he look for in the darkness of the west? She turned round, and a cry broke from her lips, for the shadows there were lurid with a deep red glow. "It looks like a fire," she said. "It is. Skene is burning like tinder." And as he spoke, it seemed that the roof fell in, for suddenly vast flames sprang up, rising high into the still night air, and they saw that the house they had just left was blazing furiously. It was a magnificent sight from the distant hill on which they stood, to watch the fire as it soared and sank, as it shot scarlet tongues along like strange titanic monsters, as it raged from room to room. Skene was burning. It was beyond the reach of human help. In a little while there would be no trace of all those crimes and all those horrors. Now it was one mass of flame. It looked like some primeval furnace, where the gods might work unheard-of miracles. "Arthur, what have you done?" asked Susie, in a tone that was hardly audible. He did not answer directly. He put his arm about her shoulder again, so that she was obliged to turn round. "Look, the sun is rising." In the east, a long ray of light climbed up the sky, and the sun, yellow and round, appeared upon the face of the earth.